This is Joseph Campanella. Bishop Sheen's spoken and written words are a treasure for God's people of all religions. The diversity of his words reflect his certainty that it is not a unity of religion that we plead for, but a unity of religious people.
One of the most important things when you're sailing is wind direction. You always have to know where the wind is coming from.
In the last couple of installments on this playlist, we discussed that before the Second Vatican Council, Archbishop Fulton Sheen was an eloquent defender of the Catholic faith. But when the winds changed with the Second Vatican Council, he changed direction along with the rest of the Novus Ordo Church. This is the conclusion of my series on Bishop Sheen. As you may recall, Bishop Sheen was tentatively scheduled to be beatified this past December 21st. However, in November, Bishop Salvatore Montano of the Rochester Diocese sent a letter to the Vatican warning that Sheen might be implicated in some litigation covering up sexual abuse while Sheen was the bishop of the Rochester Diocese. The Vatican accordingly postponed Sheen's beatification. Many people, ruled by their emotions, concocted elaborate conspiracy theories dismissing Bishop Montano's letter. In this video, we'll look at some of the information that is publicly available and see whether that information might support Bishop Montano's concern. On its website, the Diocese of Rochester lists 24 priests who have been implicated in claims of sexual abuse. I could only find the ordination dates for 22 of them, but the ordination dates go all the way back to 1938. Of those 22, 5 of them, or 23%, were ordained by Bishop Sheen himself during his short 2.5-year tenure as the Bishop of Rochester. This was clearly a problem inherited by Sheen. For instance, John F. Gormley, a priest who admitted to sexual impropriety, said that in the late 1950s, while at St. Bernard's in Rochester, he had engaged in inappropriate activity with a boy. Higher-ups told him to pray over it and allowed him to be ordained a priest. So there was a problem at St. Bernard's, and perhaps Bishop Sheen might have sensed the sort of creepy vibe from some of the seminarians as he ordained them. He probably wasn't confident in the priests running St. Bernard's that they would filter out deviants. So in December of 1967, he created a lay review board to screen St. Bernard's candidates for the priesthood. The ordination question, do you know any reason why this candidate should not be ordained, is sometimes asked too late, Bishop Sheen stated in a pastoral letter. Sheen was creating a 7-member lay group to consult with Sheen and St. Bernard's Seminary to reach a balanced judgment about certain candidates. In October of 1967, Sheen addressed the Synod of Bishops and made a dramatic appeal for radical seminary reform. He recommended to the Church's hierarchy in Rome that laymen be used for selecting candidates for the priesthood. Maybe Sheen was so desperate to add a masculine influence at St. Bernard's that he recruited an instructor from Italy with the most masculine name that he could find, Father Rocco. After Bishop Sheen resigned, he was still concerned about the priests being passed through at St. Bernard's. He said that he believed candidates for the priesthood should be given rigid psychiatric examinations at various periods of their seminary training. Priests are susceptible as laymen to psychosis and neurosis, Sheen said. Anyone who has dealt closely with men will realize that in addition to the spiritual and moral and intellectual problems, there is also this overtone of the psychotic and neurotic, he said. He added that while he had been in Rochester, he was developing plans under which no priest would be ordained in 1970, regardless of how good they were. Under his plan, priests would go out to the parishes as deacons for a year after finishing their 4 years of training. Then after a year, they would have to individually request to be ordained. Sheen said that he was going to put them out in the world, give them a test, and then he'd give them another rigid test when they entered the priesthood. So did Sheen know about the problems of individual priests but did not remove them from the priesthood? This is the key question. Some people tend to forget that it was practically built into the job description of bishops in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s to cover up sexual abuse of priests. The way that bishops did this was to transfer wayward priests from one parish to another. Of the 24 priests listed on the Rochester Diocese website for being implicated with charges of sexual abuse, 9 of them, or about 38% of them, were transferred from one parish to another by Bishop Sheen during his short 2.5 years in Rochester. Some of these transfers may have just been part of the normal rotation of priests that is typical of many dioceses. However, it appears that some of them were not. We already mentioned that Father Gormley was known to have had problems. Realizing he was troubled, the diocese transferred Gormley from Rochester to Corning, where he voluntarily underwent psychiatric counseling to control his impulses. It didn't work. The diocese later sent him to Watkins Glen. These transfers occurred prior to Bishop Sheen coming to Rochester. However, Sheen allowed Gormley to remain as a priest, and the abuse committed by Gormley while in Watkins Glen was under his watch, and that abuse resulted in multiple lawsuits. Gormley wrote a letter of apology, and he blamed his conduct on that insane behavior of mine which stemmed from the deep pathology I was laboring under at the time. His letter asserted that diocesan personnel were aware of this disorder of mine at the time of the incidents through my acknowledgement of them, of the problem, and the seeking of appropriate help for myself and those affected. And they continued to employ me without affording me that help or affording those affected by these behaviors with appropriate support and help for themselves. About 10 lawsuits have been filed in response to the activities of Father Albert H. Cason, Jr. The lawsuits all allege that the Rochester Diocese was aware of Cason's abusive nature before assigning him first to St. John the Evangelist and then to St. Patrick's in Oswego. The papers also allege that officials in both parishes were aware of Cason's proclivities but did nothing to stop him. It was Bishop Sheen who transferred Cason to St. John the Evangelist in 1969. Another priest moved around by Bishop Sheen was Father Robert F. O'Neill. According to the Democrat and Chronicle, years later, O'Neill would be named as one of the worst serial abusers ever encountered in the Rochester Diocese, and numerous accusations arose that diocesan officials knew all about it. Another priest that was moved around was Father Eugene G. Emo. While Bishop Sheen was the bishop in Rochester, a 14-year-old boy was injured when a .22 caliber rifle accidentally fell and fired while the boy and two of his friends, one was 13 years old and the other was 16 years old, were target shooting at the cabin home of Father Emo. Since this story appeared in multiple newspapers, it most certainly was brought to the attention of Bishop Sheen. He must have wondered why 3 teenage boys were hanging around Emo's cabin, and presumably Sheen had a stern talking to Father Emo. But Bishop Sheen did nothing to remove him from the priesthood. And then much later, Emo was accused of abusing another victim at that very same cabin. When Sheen resigned in Rochester, he said, "As I surrender the authority of this diocese, I ask just one thing: forgiveness for the things which I have said and should have left unsaid, and for the things I left unsaid and should have said." Well, I hope that you enjoyed this installment. I'll be back again in about a week with another video on a completely different topic. But in the meantime, please pray for the church and return to all things that are good and profitable.
Got the Fulton blues. Well, I've been to the bottom and to the top of the hill. Well, I've been to the bottom and the top of the hill.